Welcome back. As cattlemen and women know all too well, the U.S. Congress is not the only place in Washington that can have an impact on our business. From EPA to USDA, federal regulation can also hit the beef cattle industry as well. And joining me now is Kristina Butts, Executive Director of Regulatory Affairs for the Washington, D.C. office. Kristina, thanks for joining us for a few moments today.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You know, you spend a lot of your time and energy and effort focused on regulatory issues as opposed to legislative issues. Help folks understand the difference and why that matters to folks out in the country.
Well, a lot of people are very familiar with the legislative issues, what Congress is working on, what they're voting on, because there's a very strong constituent outreach component of that. But once those legislative bills actually get signed into law, they get kicked over to the regulatory side of our government. And that's really where the devil and the details become very, very important. And so when you start looking at these details, that's when you have to make sure that the congressional intent of what was passed by Congress, the House and the Senate, signed into law by President, remains throughout the regulatory process. So the fight's never over until the very, very bitter end. And the regulatory situation itself has a lot of safeguards in place and a lot of opportunities for constituents as well as industry folks to actually have a voice in that process. So, but that really is kind of a large portion of our time in Washington is not so much on Capitol Hill, which we do spend a lot of time on Capitol Hill, but also on the regulatory side as well.
So update us, what are some of the regulatory issues you've been focused on lately?
Well, one of the largest regulatory issues that we're working on right now is the EPA's proposed rule on waters of the United States. Yep. Obviously a great opportunity for producers to make sure they're submitting comments to the EPA. We also have a regulatory issue out of the Department of Agriculture, which would allow the fresh and frozen importation of beef from Brazil and Argentina. So two countries that are looking at ways on how they can improve their systems in terms of a disease known as foot and mouth disease that we have a lot of concern over, making sure it's not reintroduced back into our country through the importation of their products. So those are two regulatory issues that we're working on right now. A second one out of USDA is the dietary guidelines. So every 5 years, USDA and the Department of Health and Human Services come together and they start evaluating and reviewing all the latest nutrition research that's available to see if we need to make changes from the 2010 dietary guidelines. And that's what we're working on right now in the 2015 dietary guidelines.
Well, I want to talk to you about that. First question is, update folks a little bit about where do we stand in that evaluation and change process as it relates to the 2015 guidelines.
So we're really kind of coming to the end of the advisory process. And what that means is that over the last several years, nutrition and health influencers have been meeting in Washington and really kind of through webinars. So there's been an opportunity to be involved or at least monitoring the situation and the discussions. And they're tasked with reviewing the latest scientific research that's out there to see if a change should be warranted to change behavior problems or behavior issues for Americans, relating back obviously to a diet. The goal here is a well-balanced diet that Americans could incorporate into a whole host of different lifestyles because we are so diverse here in America. But we're finalizing kind of the end of that position where they've had their sixth and final meeting. December the 15th, they're going to have a more kind of webinar hosted meeting. This is USDA and the Department of Health and Human Services, where they're going to give the committee's recommendations to the secretaries. Then that is going to have a comment period. So that's where NCBA is really going to step up. We are going to review the recommendations this advisory committee is giving to the secretaries. And then obviously science dictates all of our conversations and all of our communication with the agency. And then at some point next year, early next year, we should have the finalized 2015 dietary guidelines. So really it's towards the end of that process.
I've heard a lot, read a lot about speculations about what may or may not be part of those guidelines. Do you care to suggest or provide your input? And more importantly, what impact does it have to cattle producers all across the country?
Well, the dietary guidelines themselves are really kind of the golden pyramid. So they are the foundation of all nutrition policy here in Washington and really throughout the nutrition profession in all of America. So when you start looking at things like the school lunch and breakfast programs, that is all the foundation looking back to the dietary guidelines. Any type of government feeding programs, senior summer feeding programs, and even military feeding programs, they all really have their basis on these dietary guidelines. So it's important that it is a scientific process. It's important that we get the information correct and accurate. And it's important that we do allow an opportunity for comments from the public to be engaged in the process. So it does play a significant role to cattle producers. Obviously, beef is the forefront. We want it to be the center protein there on the plate at all times. But we do want it to be part of a well-balanced diet. And we want to make sure that we're utilizing the latest science to make those recommendations to the agency. We did share caution early on in the process because Obviously, the committee started bringing up other areas of interest, topics like sustainability, talking specifically about the beef industry. We're not afraid to talk about that. We have a great story. We want to share it, want to talk about it. But when you look at the scope of this advisory committee, it's focused on nutrition. So we really think that the committee should stay focused on nutrition, looking at the relevant science, and to lead that as the policy discussion moves forward.
You mentioned, Kristina, waters of the United States, and we heard a lot on that during the summer and early fall. Where does that stand as we move into 2015?
We are hopeful that EPA, and hopefully with cattle producers reaching out throughout the country, will actually pull back their proposed regulation and start over. EPA has been very much so defensive and talking about how ag was not the true intent of the regulation. So our comments are, if we weren't the true intent, scrap it and start over. And maybe start over with agriculture at the table to help them develop something that might actually get to be what their true intentions were, but they're far from that right now with where the proposed rule is.
You know, one of the things that I know you and your team spend a lot of time doing is providing background information to members of Congress that may not be familiar with agriculture and specifically the beef industry. Tell us a little bit about your work there and why that's so important.
Well, we started a new program several years ago when I joined NCBA called Beef 101. And we really bring in cattle producers, researchers, experts, veterinarians from the field to come to Washington and break down some of the industry terms that we're used to talking about, pastures, genetic selection. But someone from a non-science or a non-ag background may not understand what those words mean. But obviously the staff we're talking to, they're very well educated. They're very much so wanting to be of help, but if they don't know our industry, typically they're going to recommend a vote against us. So we've really been focused on those educational efforts. It's been a great success on Capitol Hill. Our producers truly enjoy it when they come to DC and talk about what they do as a cow-calf operator, you know, what it means to be a feed yard manager, you know, the sacrifices that we take for granted. For instance, we don't open up Christmas presents on Christmas morning until after the animals have been taken care of. And those are things that we take for granted as an industry, but people outside of our industry, it's really something they haven't thought about before. But if we can help make it relatable, usually there's a better outreach afterwards and there's better follow-up when they're coming to us saying, we have this idea. Is that helpful, harmful? You know, what are your thoughts? And it's all about that relationship, and it's really about the dialogue.
Your passion is always evident when we talk. You grew up on a ranch in Texas. What makes you want to trade those ranch lands in Texas for the concrete jungle of Washington, D.C. to do our work every day?
Well, I tell you, some days it's hard because I have two young little girls. So growing up in a Capitol Hill row house, you know, is much different from where I grew up in Texas. But I tell you, I really think agriculture needs advocates in Washington. Nothing this town talks about does not impact agriculture. There's a direct connection, whether it's legislation, whether it's a congressional briefing, whether it's an oversight hearing, whether it's regulations, all have an impact on what we do and our way of life. And I think that we need to find ways to foster more people coming and getting involved in public policy to make sure that we have people with a background and understanding either writing the legislation or being involved in that dialogue. So I feel like it's a great way for me to give back to the industry that gave so much to me and my family. My family's still involved in the business. One day I hope to return home and leave DC, but not quite ready to do that yet.
Well, we're not ready for you to do that. You're a wonderful advocate for our industry. Thank you, Kristina.
Thank you.